The condition being discussed is not about ending a war. It is about redefining what counts as an acceptable state of Iran. That distinction matters more than the headline itself. Because once a conflict becomes tied to a structural demand, it stops being about battlefield outcomes and becomes about regime behavior. And regime behavior is not something that can be adjusted quickly or without consequence. The uncomfortable fact is this: linking the end of a conflict to a nuclear agreement does not shorten the conflict. It extends it into a different domain where time moves more slowly and concessions become existential. What would your country do if ending a war required changing the core of its national security doctrine? I am Liang. I track how states convert pressure into leverage and how leverage reshapes outcomes. If you want analysis that follows the structure beneath the statement, you should consider subscribing. By 2026, the framework governing Iran's nuclear program is already fractured. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, signed in 2015 between Iran and the P5+1, imposed limits on uranium enrichment and established an inspection regime under the International Atomic Energy Agency. The United States withdrew from that agreement in 2018. That is the starting point. Since then, Iran has incrementally expanded its enrichment activities. According to IAEA reporting, Iran has enriched uranium up to 60% purity, a level far above the 3.67% limit set under the original agreement, though still below weapons grade. At the same time, inspection access has become more constrained, with monitoring mechanisms reduced after disputes over compliance and sanctions. Now consider what happens when a political condition is introduced that ties the cessation of a conflict to a new nuclear agreement. The surface reading suggests leverage. Apply pressure through conflict, extract concessions through negotiation. That is a familiar pattern in international relations. But this case is not symmetrical. Iran's nuclear posture is not simply a bargaining chip. It is tied to deterrence, regime survival, and regional positioning. That changes the calculation. Move one layer deeper. Iran has observed the sequence of events over the past decade. It has seen an agreement negotiated, signed, and then abandoned by one party. It has experienced sanctions relief followed by renewed economic pressure. This history shapes how any new condition is interpreted. From Tehran's perspective, the question is not only what is being asked. It is whether compliance produces lasting security or temporary reprieve. That uncertainty is not theoretical. It is based on documented precedent. Now add the regional dimension. Israel has consistently framed Iran's nuclear capability as an existential threat and has conducted operations aimed at delaying or disrupting Iran's program. Saudi Arabia has signaled that it would pursue its own nuclear capabilities if Iran crosses certain thresholds. The Gulf states are not passive observers. They are participants in a security environment that becomes more volatile as nuclear thresholds shift. When a demand for a nuclear agreement is tied to conflict resolution, it introduces a variable that affects every actor in the region simultaneously. The deeper implication is that the demand itself alters the incentives on all sides. If Iran believes that conceding on its nuclear program reduces its deterrence without guaranteeing long-term relief, it has reason to resist. If it resists, the condition for ending the conflict remains unmet. That prolongs the conflict. At the same time, if Iran accelerates its nuclear activities to strengthen its negotiating position, the perceived threat increases, prompting stronger countermeasures from regional actors and potentially from the United States. The system becomes self-reinforcing. There is also a contradiction embedded in this approach. The more central the nuclear issue becomes to ending the conflict, the less flexible it becomes as a negotiating tool. Flexibility requires the ability to make incremental concessions. But nuclear capabilities are not easily divisible into small, reversible steps once certain thresholds are crossed. They carry symbolic and strategic weight that extends beyond the technical details. Now consider the balance of power over the next 5 to 10 years. If this dynamic continues, the region moves toward a state where nuclear latency becomes more widespread. Not necessarily the deployment of weapons, but the capability to move toward them quickly if conditions deteriorate. This is a different kind of equilibrium, one that is more unstable because it depends on rapid decision cycles under pressure. The question then is not whether a deal can be reached. It is what kind of system emerges if the deal is not. And that system may be more consequential than the agreement itself. The second layer is not military. It is economic pressure, and more specifically, how that pressure has evolved into a system that no longer behaves the way it was designed. The surface fact is clear. Since 2018, the United States has imposed extensive sanctions on Iran targeting oil exports, banking access, and financial transactions. According to U.S. Treasury data and international energy reporting, Iran's official oil exports dropped sharply after sanctions were reimposed, falling from over 2.5 million barrels per day in 2017 to significantly lower levels in subsequent years. That is the visible outcome. But the system did not stop there. It adapted. Iran did not exit the oil market. It re-entered it through different channels. By the early 2020s, multiple energy tracking firms estimated that Iranian crude exports had partially recovered through indirect routes, often involving intermediaries and reflagged shipments, with China emerging as a primary destination. Some estimates placed these flows above 1 million barrels per day, though precise figures vary and require verification. What matters is not the exact number. It is the pattern. Sanctions did not eliminate Iran's economic activity. They changed how that activity is conducted. This is the deeper layer. When financial access is restricted, alternative networks emerge. These networks are less transparent, less regulated, and more difficult to control. They rely on barter arrangements, local currency transactions, and informal financial channels. Over time, these methods become institutionalized. They are no longer temporary workarounds. They become part of the system itself. Now consider what happens when a nuclear agreement is introduced as a condition for ending a conflict. The assumption is that economic pressure will compel compliance. But this assumes that the pressure remains effective. In reality, the longer sanctions persist, the more incentive there is to develop mechanisms that reduce their impact. This is not unique to Iran. It is a pattern observed in multiple sanctioned economies. The difference here is scale and duration. There is an actor in this system whose role is consistently simplified or overlooked: China. Not as a strategic rival in abstract terms, but as a practical economic partner for Iran. China's imports of discounted Iranian oil provide revenue streams that partially offset sanctions pressure. At the same time, China gains access to energy supplies at favorable terms. This is not framed publicly as a formal alliance. It does not need to be. It functions as a convergence of interests. This changes the picture because it introduces a stabilizing factor into what is otherwise presented as a system of pressure. As long as alternative buyers exist, sanctions lose their ability to produce decisive outcomes. They can constrain, they can shape behavior at the margins, but they cannot fully dictate it. And when sanctions become less decisive, linking them to broader strategic conditions becomes more complex. There is also a feedback effect. The existence of these alternative channels encourages their expansion. Other actors observe the system and adapt accordingly. Financial networks become more fragmented. The dominance of traditional systems such as SWIFT is not eliminated, but it is gradually supplemented by parallel arrangements. Each incremental adaptation reduces the leverage of the original system. The contradiction is subtle but significant. The tools used to apply pressure contribute to the creation of systems that are less susceptible to that pressure. Over time, this reduces the effectiveness of the tools themselves. It is not a sudden shift. It is cumulative. And cumulative changes are often misread because they do not produce immediate visible breaks. Now extend this forward. If a nuclear agreement is required to end a conflict, and if the economic pressure designed to enforce that agreement is partially circumvented, the negotiating dynamic changes. Iran's position becomes more resilient than it appears in formal metrics. At the same time, the credibility of enforcement mechanisms becomes less certain. This introduces hesitation into the process, not necessarily refusal, but caution. The result is a negotiation environment where both sides question the durability of any agreement reached. Iran questions whether sanctions relief will persist. The United States questions whether compliance will be sustained. This mutual uncertainty slows progress. It extends timelines. And in the context of an ongoing conflict, extended timelines have direct consequences. Which leads to a deeper question. If economic pressure no longer produces clear outcomes, what replaces it as the primary lever of influence? The third layer sits beneath both military pressure and economic systems. It is about signaling, credibility, and the perception of commitment. The surface fact is that international agreements rely not only on their terms, but on the belief that those terms will be upheld. When that belief is weakened, the agreements themselves become less effective. Consider the sequence of the past decade. The JCPOA established limits on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. The United States withdrew from that agreement in 2018. That withdrawal was legal within domestic authority, but its international effect was broader. It signaled that commitments could change with political leadership. This is not unique to one country. It is a structural feature of political systems, but its impact on credibility is measurable. Now examine how this affects current conditions. If a new agreement is proposed as a condition for ending a conflict, Iran evaluates not only the terms, but the likelihood that those terms will endure beyond a single administration. This is the second layer. The negotiation is not about immediate compliance. It is about long-term predictability. Without predictability, concessions become riskier. This creates a strategic dilemma for the United States. To secure compliance, it must offer assurances that extend beyond the current political cycle. But providing such assurances is difficult within a system where policy can shift with electoral outcomes. This is not a failure of intent. It is a limitation of structure. Now extend this dilemma to other actors. European countries, which were part of the original JCPOA, attempted to preserve the agreement after the U.S. withdrawal. Mechanisms such as INSTEX were proposed to facilitate limited trade with Iran while bypassing U.S. sanctions. These efforts had limited success. That is the surface fact. The deeper implication is that even allied actors face constraints when attempting to maintain agreements in the face of shifting policy from a central participant. For Iran, this reinforces a pattern. Agreements can be reached, implementation can begin, but the continuity of those agreements is uncertain. This uncertainty feeds back into strategic calculations. It increases the value of maintaining independent capabilities, including nuclear latency. It reduces the incentive to fully commit to constraints that may not be reciprocated over time. Now consider the time dimension again. In 2 years, a new agreement might produce measurable compliance. In 5 years, a change in political leadership could alter its terms. In 10 years, the cumulative effect of these cycles shapes the strategic posture of all actors involved. Each cycle leaves a residue of mistrust that is not easily removed. This creates a system where negotiations are conducted under the assumption of potential reversal. That assumption changes behavior. It encourages hedging strategies. It encourages partial compliance rather than full commitment. It encourages the preservation of capabilities that can be activated if conditions change. The deepest consequence is that the negotiation process itself becomes less about resolution and more about management. Managing risk, managing uncertainty, managing timelines. This does not eliminate the possibility of agreement. It changes its nature. And this is where the tension becomes most visible. Because a condition tied to ending a conflict assumes a level of clarity and finality that the underlying system does not support. There is one more layer that rarely enters the discussion, and it sits inside domestic political systems rather than between states. The surface fact is that foreign policy decisions are influenced by domestic incentives. Elections, public opinion, legislative dynamics, these factors shape how policies are presented and how they are sustained. In the United States, positions on Iran have been highly polarized. Policies shift not only based on external conditions, but on internal political alignments. This is documented in congressional voting patterns, public statements, and policy reversals over time. The result is that foreign policy toward Iran is not a single trajectory. It is a series of adjustments reflecting domestic dynamics. For Iran, domestic politics also play a role. Hardline and reformist factions differ in their approach to negotiations and engagement with external actors. Decisions about nuclear policy are not made in a vacuum. They reflect internal debates about security, sovereignty, and economic necessity. This creates a layered interaction. External negotiations are influenced by internal pressures on both sides. These pressures are not always aligned. They can push negotiations forward or pull them back. They introduce variability that is difficult to predict. Now consider what happens when a condition for ending a conflict is placed within this environment. The condition must pass through multiple layers of domestic approval and acceptance. It must be framed in a way that is politically sustainable. That requirement constrains the range of possible agreements. The deeper implication is that even if a technically viable agreement exists, it may not be politically viable. And if it is not politically viable, it cannot be implemented. This is not a failure of diplomacy. It is a reflection of the systems within which diplomacy operates. which leads to the final unresolved point. If both external pressures and internal constraints limit the range of possible outcomes, what space remains for a solution that satisfies all sides? If this analysis is reaching you, understand that it continues only because individuals choose to engage with it. Subscribing and sharing are not signals. They are mechanisms. They determine whether analysis like this reaches others who are still looking beyond the surface. So what does all of this actually tell us? The structure of this situation is not linear. Military pressure, economic sanctions, diplomatic credibility, and domestic politics are not separate systems. They reinforce and weaken each other at the same time. Sanctions reduced Iran's official oil exports after 2018, but they did not remove Iran from the market. They redirected it. Alternative channels formed. China became a consistent buyer under discounted terms. That is not a side detail. It is the foundation of the current balance. At the same time, the withdrawal from the JCPOA demonstrated that agreements can be reversed within a single political cycle. That single fact reshaped how every subsequent negotiation is interpreted. Iran does not evaluate offers only on paper. It evaluates their durability. That changes what it is willing to concede. Military deterrence then sits on top of this uncertainty. It limits escalation, but does not resolve the underlying dispute. It freezes the situation in place. Now connect these layers. Economic pressure without full enforcement creates adaptation. Diplomatic agreements without long-term credibility create hesitation. Military containment without resolution creates time. And time in this system does not reduce risk. It redistributes it. Each year that passes strengthens alternative networks, deepens mistrust, and narrows the space for decisive agreements. This is why the condition tying conflict resolution to a nuclear deal does not behave as a simple leverage mechanism. It sits inside a system where leverage itself is diffused. No single actor controls the outcome. Not fully. Not consistently. The structure resists clean solutions. The result is not stalemate in the traditional sense. It is managed instability. A condition where pressure is applied, responses are calibrated, and escalation is contained, but nothing fundamental is resolved. And that condition can persist longer than most political cycles anticipate. And before this analysis ends, there is one more thing that needs to be said clearly. Watch the enforcement patterns of sanctions, not their announcements. If Iranian oil continues to reach markets through indirect channels, then economic pressure remains incomplete by definition. Watch the posture of China more closely than public statements suggest. Its purchasing decisions and financial arrangements will indicate whether alternative systems continue expanding. And watch signals of long-term commitment in any proposed agreement. Not the language, but the mechanisms designed to survive political transitions. There is uncertainty here. Enforcement can tighten. Political alignments can shift. Unexpected events can compress timelines. But the direction of the system is observable. It is moving toward fragmentation rather than consolidation, toward parallel systems rather than a single dominant framework. The outcome will not be determined by one decision or one agreement. It will be shaped by whether these underlying structures harden or reverse. That is where attention should remain. This analysis is provided for educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute policy advice, intelligence assessment, or advocacy for any government or political position. The observations presented here are drawn from publicly available sources and represent an independent analytical interpretation. The voice you are hearing in this video is AI-generated. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources, compare perspectives, and arrive at their own conclusions based on a broad range of information. Staying informed about how power actually moves requires effort. Not attention to headlines, but attention to structure. That is a choice, and it is one of the most consequential choices a person can make. Share this with one person who is paying attention but still missing the deeper pattern beneath what they are seeing. Not a group, one person. That is how understanding spreads. Leave one comment with your own reading of where this situation is heading or the country you are watching most closely right now. Every comment, every share, extends the reach of analysis that is not shaped by convenience. There is a decision being prepared somewhere that has not yet been announced, and when it is, it will not be framed in the way it should be understood. I am Professor Liang Wu. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never mistake a quiet news day for the absence of history being made.